Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. We're opening the doors and letting folks in. Okay. Give folks just another second to log on. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Accelerating Recovery Through Credentials webinar about better serving adult learners. My name is Brett Bisger. I am Senior Director of Postsecondary Attainment at Education Strategy Group. I am joined today by some wonderful folks from the field who will provide their perspective on where this fits today. And so I am joined by Katie Abel, who is the Associate Commissioner of External Affairs, Mass Department of Higher Ed, Kenyatta Lovett, who is the Managing Director of Educate Texas, and Hei Okimoto, who is the Associate Vice President of Student Affairs and Director of Academic Technologies at the University of Hawaii. Before, what we're going to do, we're going to take a few minutes. ESG recently released the Adult Ready Playbook through Accelerating Recovery through Credentials. We'll talk through that framework and then engage with our panelists to learn from their experiences on working with adult learners. And they have all had a very rich set of experiences. So I'm going to share my screen and get going with PowerPoint. As I mentioned, Brett Bisger, the Accelerating Recovery Through Credentials is an initiative that we were able to stand up with the generous support from our friends at Ascendium and Kresge Foundations. And really, the goal is to try to get scalable policy and practice resources and trying to help higher ed shift to be able to be more responsive to the needs of adult learners and earning credentials. And this is especially important now with the pandemic and the recovery. And so part of the big pressure is trying to figure out all of the multiple priorities and the challenges that folks had. So the first thing we came out with, there are two components. One is the Rapid Response Toolkit, which is looking at the immediate needs of people who are displaced and how those things work for folks and how institutions can pivot to be responsive. The second was a comprehensive adult playbook, really trying to take this piece that there are tremendous resources available for adult learners, but the tendency is to think about it in either programmatic ways or in very specific slices. How could we create a framework to put it together? And that was the goal of the playbook. So in doing this, it wasn't just ESG. We pulled together a wonderful group of experts from the field practitioners, policy experts from national organizations, institutions, of which Dr. Lovett was one of the wonderful members, providing guidance to us on key questions, response to our initial framing, all sorts of key components. We also pulled together a philanthropic advisory group, really with the hope of trying to understand ways to better connect these resources in ways that would resonate more with the field, trying to understand what were pathways and getting a sense of who's doing innovative work in this space around the country. And then we did a tremendous amount of desk research, lit review, and then went even further to, as we started to surface exemplars, interview a broad range of folks to inform this work going forward. As I mentioned, the initial piece was the Rapid Response Toolkit, which we put out in March, all really trying to focus on how do you get people who are facing the urgencies of needing reskilling and address their needs. Then this brings us to today, which is the about the Adult Ready Playbook. We've put forward this comprehensive vision. I think one of the things that is important to note is what we mean when we're talking about adult learners. And so we're taking this from the frame of folks, but predominantly around age, but thinking about either beginning or re-enrolling for the many some college no degree folks, to look at re-enrolling at 25 or older. But we also really tried to think about framing it not just in age, but recognizing this concept of post-traditional learners and trying to think about the norms that are happening with post-traditional learners and framing this as the positivity of where it's going. Now, we talk about adult learners a lot, and it's been a burgeoning conversation, but they are not a monolith. We've got low-skilled learners, we have people with GED, we have people with high school diplomas, we have people who already have degrees or certificates who are returning. We even have a lot of people who are some college no degree. Part of this is also recognizing we need to move to asset-based language for these populations, because they are folks who are trying to strive for themselves and their families. But for many of you, recognizing that adult learners are assets in the classroom, they're assets in the institution. And if anybody has been in a classroom with adult learners, you recognize they are motivated, they do the work, they show up to class, they do all the things that you want learners to do. But so many of the conversations are talking about, well, what are the gaps? What are the needs that adult learners have? Let's think about their assets first, and then try to shift and focus on where those assets are. We are also in a critical time where we are at a pandemic, and there are likely a lot of people who are needing work. There's still millions of people out of work. There's a lot of conversation about the Great Resignation and where folks are really looking to make changes. There are signals that people are wanting to come back and engage in post-secondary so that they can create better lives for themselves and their families. We took all this research, and as I mentioned, our goal was to put together a comprehensive framework. And we did this by creating 5 priority areas. And these are the 5. Accessibility. And accessibility is really about ensuring that the conditions are there so adults know they can go back and pay for it and understand that those pieces are there. Program change, trying to recognize what are the ways that post-traditional learners can feel engaged. meet their time needs, understanding their pressures. Operational change, recognizing where the intersection from administrative systems, not just the classroom teaching from program change, but operational change. How can we streamline and move those things? The role of data, understanding that it is critical to understand where we are, and there's a mixed bag that exists at present around data. And then the role of partnerships. The playbook itself has these 5 priorities. Within these 5 priorities, we have 11 strategies underneath them in total that unpacked to 29 different tactics. Taken in a whole, the playbook is large. It's over every single page added together. It's 160 pages. But we thought, geez, if we just put out a single 160-page document, it would be overwhelming. So we created this into chunks, and we'll talk through the part. There's an overview, a user guide, self-assessments for the institutions or states, and then action guide with the accessibility, program change, all of those. In each of those instances, the action guides unpack, give case studies, talk about exemplars, provide context for the strategies and tactics for each of those. So they go into depth, and it's kind of like almost a bit of a choose your own adventure as people start to drive down into all of these pieces. So the user's guide, we're really focusing this on building a continuous improvement process. So much of higher ed, we'll pull together a committee and we will plan for 12 months, come up with a great plan, and want to do everything all at once. There are tremendous assets that institutions are building from, and that they are working and moving forward and trying to do these things. Build off those assets. So again, starting with those 5 priorities, but articulate the end state. Get an idea of where you want to go, and then engage in a continuous improvement process. And this is where all of these 5 components fit, trying to get a sense of where all this fits. So one of the first steps that we have is getting into self-assessment. So you get a sense of overall where you think you want to go as an institution. Then dive into the self-assessment, see where you are in all of those points. And there's one for the states, and there's one for institutions. They are intended to be tools to start planning. Then it's about recognizing where you are and taking relevant action. So we created steps in here. So one is to implement, which is in sense a baseline. If you haven't done anything in this area, what can you implement to get started? To improve is how do you maybe take the next step to move this to a bigger scale and all of that. Next level is really trying to think about bigger, bolder systems change. The part that we recognize with this, it is nonlinear, and that everybody kind of comes in at different places. You may have started and have implemented already something in the to improve category and blew off what we have for to implement. That's okay. It's also just recognizing where you are. So just to give a flavor of what the action guides are, I'm not going to spend too long unpacking them because you can all look through. But for example, accessibility, 3 strategies. Thinking number 1 is about ensuring institutional aid works for all learners and state aid. Number 2 is thinking about financial levers to increase the likelihood of engagement and progression. And then 3 is about comprehensive outreach. So to give more concrete examples of how this plays out, strategy 1, underneath we have to implement. So it is trying to think about and look at how do you reduce barriers within current financial aid programs are designed for post-traditional learners. Recognizing that there are a heck of a lot of aid programs, the way they are structured, don't provide accessibility to post-traditional learners. Things like had to graduate from high school in the last year, other questions and trying to where that fits. To improve, trying to think about recognizing for especially a lot of people, what's the role of emergency grants? And it's a tremendously important offering in moving folks forward. And then going to next level is braid state and federal funding. I have been kicking around post-secondary improvement for a long time. I've been in a lot of conversations about braiding funding, and there are a lot fewer examples of people doing it effectively. I think people talk about it, but there's lots of opportunities to drive and do it more effectively. And we hope in each of these instances within our guidebook, we provide exemplars and then case studies on the parts to implement. As we're getting into program change, 3 big strategies, really trying to look at deliver program in adult-friendly ways, design programs for flexibility and convenience. And Dr. Okimoto is going to talk some about what they've done at University of Hawaii about those pieces. Developing pathways that leverage and support skill preparation. Again, we can get into all of these pieces to implement, think about systemic ways to do credit for prior learning. This is really critical for getting folks bad. For on-ramps, for low-skilled students, maximize IETs, where those things fit. And you all can read through where this fits. The operational change, thinking about one-stop student experience and partnerships to move that forward. Thinking about efficient systems for focused, tailored student advising. Data is also really critical. One of the things that, and I made some allusion to this before, think about common metrics for and definitions of post-traditional learners and set up ways for your data systems to track them. A lot of times people just say, oh, it's 25, but they don't track age at first entry. So they're counting folks who started at 18 and continuously enrolled, as well as people who just started a year ago, trying to figure out where those are, doing analyses so that you can understand where that fits, leveraging national data sets, et cetera. And then partnerships is really critical, trying to think about what the role of employers and workforce systems to promote program relevance. Again, making connections. Adults tend to want strong connection to what's going to happen next. They want to know that their education and training is going to lead to something concrete for them. Providing partnerships to provide critical wraparound supports. And we have a great case study from Massachusetts that's going to provide some insights into where that fits. So this is the super high level overview of the playbook. Recognizing there's so much to go into. As I said, there's 160 pages. It's hard to do it all credit at the moment. It's on our website. Chances are, if you're here, you've seen the link and had to opportunity to kick around. Please invite you to go look at it. But what I'd like to do is pivot now and start a conversation with our panelists, recognizing that their perspective as folks who are working to move the systems to really improve opportunities for students is a lot of salience. So with that, thank you. What we'll do is have targeted questions for our panelists to start off with, have a conversation. People who are participating, please use the chat. Drop in questions. If you have questions in real time that are relevant to what's happening, please drop them in. And then we'll also have time at the end to open up for broader Q&A. So with that, I'd like to thank and welcome my panelists and ask them to start with describing your respective institutions organization and or state and prioritizing or why you are trying to advance adult learners. So who would like to start?
Well, I can start being the farthest west of everybody in this group. Aloha, everyone. I'm Heio Kimoto. And, one of the reasons why so first, a description of our system. I actually represent the University of Hawaii system, which is made up of 7 community colleges and 3 four-year institutions. So we are the only public state institution in our state. So, and one of the reasons why we got into this work was back in 2007, 2008, we actually set a goal for our state through the work that we had with Complete College America on 55 by 25. We set out this goal that 55% of our adult students, and we define adult as 25 to 64 years old, that they would have by year 2025 some sort of recognized higher education credential. So back in 2017, about halfway, 10 years later, when we looked at our data, we realized that we were only at the 46.3%, and we weren't going to get to the 55%. So we decided that we better do something if, in fact, we have set this very public goal of 55 by 25, and we need to work actively and intentionally to getting toward that goal, because we all know in higher ed that these degrees are instrumental in moving our state forward. And education is one of the largest employers in our state also. I'll turn it over to the next person.
Katie, do you want to go next?
Sure, just to keep us rolling from one side of the country to another. Hi, everyone from Massachusetts. We have a soggy day here, but glad to be with all of you. We are focused in Massachusetts. I work for the Department of Higher Education, which primarily oversees the public college and university system, which consists of 29 undergraduate campuses. Massachusetts loves to talk about being the state with more adult degree holders than any other state in the country. It is definitely a point of pride, as is the history of higher education in Massachusetts. However, along with many illustrious institutions, and along with having, a very strong number of degree holders, we have huge inequities in higher education. And I think it's fair to say that most of my colleagues would ascribe to the view that higher education now is involved in perpetuating inequities as much as we are hoping to alleviate them. And for those reasons, the Department of Higher Education is responding to a charge from our board to make racial equity the #1 strategic priority for higher ed, both in terms of our policy and programmatic work. So I'm here to talk to you about how that racial equity agenda is kind of the overlay of all of our work. I have some data I'll be happy to share, Brett, if you give me a cue at some point on what is happening in terms of enrollment declines, looking at the 18 to 24s versus 24 and above. It's a very interesting picture. My work specifically focuses on basic needs insecurity for all students, regardless of age. And it's in that context that we've developed some partnerships that may be helpful for some folks to hear about as you look specifically at adult students. And I'll pass to Kenyatta.
Thank you. And I'll start by saying first, congratulations to ESG on the second release. The toolkit, if you haven't read it, everyone, it's a good resource for something that's immediately relevant today, given that COVID-19 is continually having impacts on our society. And then this playbook is a necessary element if you are really looking into transformative change for your state, your system, your institution. I started working with this effort at my time as the Assistant Commissioner of Workforce Development in Tennessee. And everyone kind of laughs about how I find myself in these weird moments where these interesting opportunities pop up. And so you can imagine me coming from higher education, going into workforce development, and then being presented with challenges from COVID-19. All of it converged where higher education was challenged, our adults out there across the state were challenged. And then when you look at the UI claims, it's just hard to fathom how we even got through it. What I learned from that experience, and there are a few things we'll talk about later on some interventions there, is that our programs work, but our systems are broken. And so in moving over to Texas, one thing that's given me a lot of confidence in the work ahead is one that the state of Texas has set an attainment goal of 60% by 2030, but it was only for individuals 25 through 34. The commissioner of that coordinating board did a refresh on the 60 by 30 Texas goal, which now includes adults. And in Texas, there are about 4 million adults with some college and no degree. While our work at Educate Texas doesn't specifically focus on adults, going back to the programs working, but the systems being broken, we do have several programs where, in the spirit of this playbook, we know that if we can build better systems of collaboration, of data sharing, data resource, that this is going to support, all Americans. It's not just our traditional students or our adult students. But what I loved about what's in the playbook, and I think it states here, approximately 85% of college students have characteristics of post-traditional learners. And so this is not necessarily a new thing that we need to do in higher education. This is just a reimagining of the values that we have for what a student looks like today.
Thank you. And so I want to pivot into a question about COVID that came up in a couple of pieces. So how has COVID-19 created more urgency in your work? And then to the other part, which is the elephant in the room, related to multiple stimulus efforts. How and in what ways can stimulus be used to advance some of the efforts to support adult learners? Why don't we start, since Katie, I think, has a slide that might be relevant to this. Why don't we start with Katie and then go to Hay and back to
I'm afraid I don't have a slide, but
Okay.
I have some stats, okay, that I'm happy to share with you. But just in terms of the enrollment decline, so I think this is true across the country, and it's certainly true in Massachusetts, that we're seeing seismic shifts in enrollment. What's interesting in our state, and I'd love either in the chat or my colleagues from Hawaii or Tennessee to share what they're seeing, but in Massachusetts from fall 19 to fall 20, in terms of adult students, we had a 7.6% decline in undergraduates aged 25 to 34. We had a 5.7% decline 35 to 44, and then a 17% decline adults 44 plus. Now, what's interesting is, these are in a normal time, these would be a source of alarm, and they are, but compared to what we're seeing in enrollments in first-time freshmen, among first-time freshmen, they are smaller. So perhaps that could be viewed strategically or politically as an opportunity. Perhaps it is a signal that adults are more likely to stay the course than first-time freshmen. Again, looking at the community colleges in Massachusetts, the decline among first-time freshmen, 32.6% from fall 19 to fall 20. I mean, that's off the charts. And even bigger than that 32% when you look at students of color. So that's a quick capsule of an enrollment decline, but opportunity there.
Yeah, and I can go next. Now, I'll just say, COVID-19 has really kind of elevated what was already a long-standing issue out there for the adult learner. One of the things that we definitely learned during this time is the strange relationship between unemployment insurance claims and skills. And so what we witnessed was a lot of industries totally shutting down, and then individuals, and this is a good conversation about using credentials, that individuals did not have a means by which the skills that they've earned would be translatable to industries that were in demand. And so one example of that would be, while we did see a lot of restaurants close, and hospitality and tourism was hard hit, logistics and supply chain management and other places were in sharp demand. So I think one of the things I think COVID-19 has created in terms of an urgency for adults is that we have a skills gap issue that needs a new type of solution, where the timeline, the entry points for not just adults but all Americans needs to be rethought so people can have on and off ramps with higher education to keep moving in their lives. The other thing I think from the employer perspective that we learn about adults is that without those skills, and we're seeing it now in a bad way, our economic potential is vastly shrinking because employers cannot fill orders. They cannot hire the talent. Therefore, our productive capacity as a state or as a nation is highly constrained. So, those are two that I really saw that were of the extreme nature. And I'd say one of the promising things that came out of it was making correlations between things like adult education and higher education, or making correlations between how do short-term credentials have a play in this to get people quickly to work, but how do you articulate or transfer those credits so they can continue on with their degree? And I say the last one is really having a conversation now about transferable skills. So you may have majored in the arts, but you bring some skill sets and some competencies that we need to articulate, formalize, and recognize that can quickly get you into the workforce and actually address some of the employer situations that we have right now.
I'll build upon what Kenyatta just ended with in the whole area of transferable skills, et cetera. Hawaii is such a heavily tourist funded industry, economy. And so COVID, obviously, I think before COVID, we had almost the lowest unemployment rates in the nation. Once COVID hit, we had probably the highest because we are so tourism driven. But what I think this area has made us as an institution start thinking about are, we've been fiddling and thinking about transferable skills. We've been thinking about stackable credentials and how do we get people skills so they can return to into the workforce. But let's not just give them the minimal skills to get back into maybe a new area, but how do we then relay those into full credentials at the university? Oftentimes when we look at the evaluations from our students who are in our 5-week classes, oftentimes they say, my employer is committed to this and they will actually give me a little bit more time to even study during the day, during specific, midterm final time, so that I can be successful, because it benefits our employers when they have college educated, college credentialed employees. So I think, with all the federal stimulus, we've often looked at our innovation efforts being maybe funded with our foundations, but maybe now we possibly could be starting to look at where does this federal money, how can we use this to fundamentally shift the needs of and support the needs of our state, so that we can move into maybe other economies and diversify just from tourism and supporting our military, which are our two highest.
And wanted to add one thing, and that goes back to really the self-assessment for states. And one of the things I like that was clearly identified in there was braided state and federal funding. And you mentioned it, Brett, that there's limited evidence of individuals or groups or organizations or states using this in a much more intentional way. And when we look at the big wave of federal funds that have hit our higher ed institutions and our K-12 systems, a lot of our philanthropic organizations have been kind of pushed away on the side seat because they've got this huge volume of dollars that they have to spend, and they're not quite thinking about how do you mix it all together to really make transformation happen. And so one thing that I hope with this federal funds, anything that comes out new, is that it does encourage partnerships. It does encourage the braiding of funds, because any thought of some sort of monolithic funding solution that's going to solve all problems is just problematic. Mm-hmm. But if you bring them all together, you start to get back to my point, which is something I've learned of late, is that, yeah, our programs work just fine. but systems of transformation are highly broken. So hopefully in the future, there will be some ways in which we can equip organizations and states of how to break funding in the right way. But, you know, when we're starting to issue out grant opportunities, it should encourage that to happen in the first place, because, you know, you can spend down one grant and still not meet your goal, and spend down the next grant and can't meet your goal. Or you can meet your goal and the next group met the goal with the same type of funding, but none of that matches up to transformation for the community.
That's a great point, and really actually a interesting segue to the next question, which is related to as you really started and to advance these efforts, what resources did you use to leverage to start or scale these efforts, and then recognizing that resources are things that are often beyond monetary resources. So what other resources were useful for you in advancing kind of an adult learner agenda, and thinking about it in those ways? So Kenyatta, your mic's up. You want to jump in?
Got to remember to hit that mute. I'd say there's only one resource that matters the most to me, and that has mattered the most on Conversations for Adults, and it's the adult voice. And I'll use an example in Nashville. We did a learning tour to talk to adults across the city in areas where there was low attainment, high poverty, high diversity. And we allowed them to be sort of a board of advisors to employers and city leaders, and just tell us, for those who don't know, in Tennessee, you know, adults can go to community college for free. So you would think it would be a slam dunk that enrollment gains would just be off the charts, but, you know, there are tons of no thank yous. And so in asking, you know, individuals, whether it was homeless youth or immigrant and refugee populations and others who are just not part of the ecosystem of higher ed and workforce development, you know, will tuition coverage for community college be all that you need to enroll in college? And the answer was clearly absolutely not. Listening to that voice had so much transformation in the city and the state of understanding that a lot of times you don't really need to create new funds. You just need to rethink how you're working your programs, where those programs are being accessible to adults that need this the most. But then sometimes there are some policy changes that can be made. So one of the policy changes that came from the voices of these adults across Nashville was a program called Nashville Grad, where they realized that without the supports of, you know, those things related to housing and food insecurities, transportation challenges, that free tuition is only just half of the equation of success. And so the mayor's office went and raised funds, and actually has a program out for Nashville State Community College to supplement not only just Tennessee Reconnect, but also Tennessee Promise. But I say that if you don't listen to the adult voice on what they need and what they value, what I learned is you can highly miss the mark and create programs that just don't address their needs.
You know, and I would like to just add right onto that, in the sense that when we started our work, we literally had a Returning Adults Conference, where we brought together faculty, and state policymakers, university leadership, our Board of Regents members. And the focus of that was having our adult students speak. And that raised the fact that, in fact, as Brett, you said, and all of everyone has said over the course of this half hour so far, that the adult learner is not monolithic. So we had, you know, different adult learners speaking about their particular experiences and their particular challenges. And so that helped ground our state and our university in where we were going, because we could then go back and say, remember when so-and-so said this? This is that example. And remember when so-and-so said that? This is why this policy has to change. And when you can point to real people and real stories, I think it makes it much more relevant and much more urgent, so that we are willing to work hard, and we're willing to say, okay, well, it doesn't sound like it should work. But we're going to try it. Let's iterate. And if it doesn't work, we can iterate again to find the correct solution.
I just want to piggyback on what both of you have said and kind of reintroduce myself as a student who received her bachelor's degree at age 52. So I went through the experience that we're talking about. And I would say that to the point of adult students are not monolithic, and in my classes at the University of Massachusetts, where I was enrolled in a program called University Without Walls that was developed for post-traditional students, all of us, whether we were someone like me working at the Department of Higher Education or someone who was waitressing and hoping for a better job, all of us felt we were imposters. All of us knew that the university, and I don't mean that UMass in particular, but any university was not created for us. So addressing that feeling, which can impact so much of your experience, is so important. And the way that we dealt with it was through a hybrid program, mostly online, but being there part of the time. We helped each other through, and we bucked each other up and made ourselves feel, when we had experiences that made us feel, you don't belong here. This is not, no. We support each other. So that's really important, I think, on a personal level, just to put that in there about the notion of a cohort being so important for students and support, to Brett's points. Adult students, we can present as really having our act together because we are multitaskers. We've been raising the kids and doing all these things. That's true. But boy, do we need support from our faculty advisors and others, perhaps as much, if not more, because we are juggling so many things outside the classroom. So to hold it all together, please give us the support we need. To what Kenyatta was saying about the promise of free college and all that's left out of that promise, and I don't mean Tennessee specifically, but I mean in the more global sense, usually free college does refer to tuition and fees. We have launched a basic needs security agenda in Massachusetts, and it has recently taken root within our academic affairs division, out of recognition that basic needs security, addressing housing and hunger issues and transportation and shelter, these are all, we believe, essential underpinnings of the undergraduate experience. But this is a new mindset, and I wouldn't say that we're totally comfortable with that in Massachusetts yet. But just one stat to share with everyone about the importance of addressing these issues, whether it's transportation, housing, food. We participate annually, many of our public campuses, in the Hope Center for College Community and Justice's surveys, annual surveys, national surveys of student basic needs and security. And in Massachusetts, last survey that we did as a state pre-COVID, in Massachusetts, 66% of adult students, 66% said they had experienced housing insecurity the previous year. Pause on that. That is outrageous and frightening to me, because there are so few solutions, and because higher education is not really that focused on the issue of housing, which seems at the periphery of so much of what's happening within the academy. 66% of adults. So something that we're trying to address, it's going to be years in the making before we get there as we should, but we are putting together, and we'll be presenting our board in the fall, in October next month, with a basic needs security plan for students, not just adults, but what we're seeing from the data is adults and suffering.
Thank you, Katie. Actually, I'm going to appreciate you, sharing your story. I mean, it's very important to, again, as folks have said, recognize where these are real people, real lives, and what's the importance of doing this. Your partnership guide that you did in Massachusetts is highlighted in the action guides as a case study. And can you just take a second to talk a little bit about why now? Why did Mass Department of Higher Ed decide this is really a great topic that we have to dive into? Why this? Why now?
We were getting indications from our campuses that students were wandering into student affairs offices and saying, hey, my mom just kicked me out, or I thought I could stay with my, my friend's family. I've been couch surfing, but I'm out of luck. I don't have anywhere to sleep tonight. And it was the housing issue in particular that campuses were saying to us, can you connect us with any resources? So several years ago, at least in our state, we did not have strong connections between community resources, particularly around housing, and the campuses, which needed to change because people were unable to respond to students. And we had students, we learned of students who were sleeping at Logan Airport, sleeping at train stations, sleeping under bridges, and still managing to be enrolled. So, but that's too much to ask, that level of resilience. So in Massachusetts, and there's a federal version of this as well, and I imagine in many other states, there exists the Governor's Interagency Council on Housing and Homelessness. So we were asked by the Secretary of Education to connect with this interagency council. And what emerged from that was a partnership between the Department of Higher Education and the Executive Office of Health and Human Services. They were interested, it was in their interest to work with us because the calculus was simple and obvious. If we can address homelessness among a population of students that's already enrolled in college and working toward degree attainment, we are increasing the likelihood that we're not going to be dealing with those students at age 50, 60, 70 living on the streets. So they saw the benefit of working with higher ed, and that began a partnership. It is too focused on younger students, I'll be frank, but we have a wonderful scholarship program with a nonprofit called One Family, working with adult students who have children, and we fund a scholarship for them, and they receive tremendous wraparound support. So work in progress, but we're on our way.
Good. Thank you so much. And then, hey, also, as we're talking about some exemplars, we highlighted as a case study University of Hawaii system to effort to pivot to 5-week courses. So can you take a minute just to talk about one, how you structured, how did you engage faculty and get this started, and what's where do things stand about sustaining?
Thank you. So our 5-week, obviously, our 5-week courses could not be successful without our faculty. But I can tell you that it was not always, it's not an easy kind of relationships, because one of the things, if you recall back, we had this returning adult conference. We found out what students wanted and needed. And several things that they consistently spoke about is, especially in an online environment, consistency of the look and feel of the course. They don't want to be wandering around in the ether trying to figure out where's the syllabus, how do I enter the discussion board. And because we had compressed it to 5 weeks, we had to be very clear in terms of, we actually created a checklist for every class. This week I have to do this. And as they read, as they discussed, as they turned in, they could check off. And the students really liked it because it helped them. Because one of the things that consistently comes up in evaluations is time management is key to success. And these tools help them manage their time because they are juggling so many priorities in their life. So shift back to then the faculty, faculty, and having been in the classroom, I want my freedom to design the course the way I want it to. And yet we have to say, for our adult students who are so short of time, but who are passionate about learning, and maybe they're not passionate about learning, but they're passionate about getting through and getting their degree, we have to kind of rethink, what are the core things you need to have students learn? We're not gonna say that 5 weeks is really about flexibility and convenience, because we don't want to water down the curriculum. Students at the end of that course have to learn you have to cover all the the learning objectives, because that course is the foundation for the next course. So when we first started this, we actually had faculty apply, and they said, and we only took faculty who had experience teaching online first. Most of them had 16-week online experience. And then we had them go through a training program. We actually used Quality Matters. And the reason why we had them go through the training program was that when they work with our instructional designers, they had to have a common language. What do these rubrics mean? And so by having them go through this, then when the instructional designer said, X, they knew what X meant. And we required them to put together a course map. And then we paid them initially, the first go around. We gave them stipends to say, we'll pay for your Quality Matters. You have to go through these checklists. You have to apply, and then we'll get you through this. Now, unfortunately, as we talked about, we ended up receiving some funding to do this. The funding has kind of gone away, and yet we still have to continue to support this. Now what we're finding, our faculty are still willing to apply and to participate, partly because of the comments from their peers. Oftentimes peers have said, I thought I knew what I was doing. I really learned a lot about teaching online. I learned about what students need and desire without impacting the quality of my curriculum. Of course, now the hard thing for us as we think about the future is, while we have faculty willing, if a faculty is teaching 4 classes, during that 1 5-week term, it's tough, because we've also told faculty, you have to respond to students within 24 hours. You have to do this because adult students, when they submit their assignments, you need to give them feedback, because that feedback it scaffolds the next assignment and the next assignment. And so part of the things that we're thinking about from the instructional component, or the dean's component, actually department chairs, are how do I, in fact, if Katie is teaching 1 5-week course and 3 16-week courses, how do we manage that? Do we actually have Katie teach 3 5-week courses plus 1 16-week across the board? So there are some administrative operational challenges that we're still working through. The interesting thing I'd like to say is that, our students love the fact that they can focus on 1 course at a time. And our statistics indicate that the students are doing better. Now the question is, other students are hearing about it, the 18-year-old, the 19-year-old saying, hey, why can't I take those classes? So thinking about, might this model work for others? The traditional age students want to be on campus for the social aspects, but does education, and so actually I think this is a really interesting way for us to finally institutionalize the whole flipped classroom model, the hybrid model, and elevate the actual instruction overall across our system.
Thank you so much. So many fascinating layers. We could probably do a webinar on each of those pieces. I know we shouted out to folks at the beginning that we would open conversation questions to the audience, and want to throw it out really quickly. We haven't seen much action in the chat. Are there things that people would like to ask either of the panelists or about the playbook? Any points?
I have a question for Katie, maybe. Partly because, with our 5-week courses and the way our financial aid is set up, we are thinking that, we have funding so that we can provide grants to the student for their first 5-week course, so that by the time they get to the second, they're part-time students and we can provide financial aid. How might you have a suggestion for us in terms of lining basic student needs with the financial security and our 5 weeks, and what advice might you give us?
Well, I want to preface this by saying I don't run financial aid programs for the state of Massachusetts, and it's So setting that aside, I can tell you some of the things that we're looking at in terms of basic needs recommendations that may be things that other states, could consider, and maybe that's helpful. One thing regarding basic needs and security, we know that a lot of adult students will be eligible for SNAP and don't know it soon because they're in college, whatever. So one of the things that we have done is partner with our state's Department of Transitional Assistance and with external advocates who frankly have been the ones to give us a nudge and say, hey, Department of Higher Education, you need to communicate with students. So literally in the next couple of days, every student with a 0 EFC is going to receive a letter from the commissioner saying you may be eligible for SNAP. And what's going to make that letter a little bit different is we've taken out all the state agency mumbo jumbo and put it in plain English. That's really important. And number two, the commissioners closed that letter by saying when he was a grad student with 2 young kids, he was on what at that time was known as food stamps. So encouraging students to make use of that benefit, because we know there's a lot of stigma attached. So that's one small thing. The other thing that we hear from all students, but I think this is particularly a burden on adult students, if you think of the way campuses are laid out, you might have to go to 17 different offices to deal with all of the different needs or issues that you have. So creating that single stop model to help students navigate the campus, I think, again, helpful to all students, but in particular, we have heard many student complaints about there not being one place that they can go to get the information they need in a quick fashion.
And that's there's a lot in the playbook around the role of navigators, single points of contact. So we have 3 minutes and we're going to go, and since there's only been Cody's question about the recording that will be available, we're going for 1 minute rapid fire answers to each of you about, from your general advice to folks on, what would you do? What are the first steps you would recommend to people to get started? So real practical, how do you get this moving? How do you launch the agenda?
I'll start really fast. I think data speaks volumes. So if you have data that can start the conversation about success or non-success, then having good data and creating partnerships. And I think the key point that I would like to end with is you have to be open and willing to truly listen, because you might start with, I think this, but by listening and being willing to collaborate with your partners, I think you end up with a better program at the very end.
Thank you.
I can echo that. Data is everything. In Massachusetts, for example, we don't know who our student parents are because we don't collect data on who's a parent. I'd love to see that change. If you are on a campus, give your state oversight agency a nudge to work with and help leverage other state agency partners with resources.
Yeah, one of the great things in the playbook that I loved and I recommend is, it's probably 2 parts. One, finding that intermediary that can collect the voices, the programs, the resources from organizations and institutions that would support the adult. And I think from that, also creating this network, a regional network to provide that support. And one example would be in Illinois. I believe they're trying to go with regional prior learning assessment centers. Instead of the institutions doing it, it would be one regional place where the adults would go into. And so that part of the playbook, I think people really need to explore how they could create that across their state or in their region.
Excellent. Well, we are at the hour. I thank both the panelists and the attendees for your time today and the rich conversation, great examples. So thanks to everybody. And should you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to follow up, and be sure to download and view the playbook. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks again. Take care.